How can such a pretty wife make such bad coffee?
Honey, your coffee just doesn't taste any good.
Forget the coffee, Marge. It's never very good.
Harold, is the coffee all right?
Mm-mm.
The desk sergeant at the station makes better coffee than this.
Try to do something about your coffee.
Harvey, want anything special for your birthday?
Just a decent cup of coffee.
You're kidding.
I'm serious. Honey, your coffee's undrinkable.
It's pretty harsh.
Well, so's your coffee.
This is the Dr. Junkie Show. I'm Ben Boyce. I'm guessing that right now you might be thinking two things. How on earth did U.S. corporations sell coffee using such sexist ads? And what the heck does Dialectics of Coffee mean? What kind of name for an episode is that? I've had this episode on the back burner for a while. Every time I thought it was done, I'd see another book I wanted to check out, or I'd discover some new historical link I wanted to try to add, or I'd just get distracted by some other project. Squirrel. But as it slowly evolved, I started to notice a pattern in coffee. And this pattern seems to run through politics, capitalism, religion, sexuality, culture. In all of these areas, there were two distinct sides of the discussion about coffee. That's kinda what dialectic means, simply. The word has a long philosophical history, but it basically means that nothing simply exists in a state of permanence. We humans play with stuff, we evaluate new information based on our own unique histories, and we frequently see things not really as good or bad, but as both, depending on the circumstances and your unique perspective. And coffee has long been stuck in this in-between world of humanness because it's been around with us for a long time, upwards of 1,000 years or so, although no one really knows when the Ethiopians who first discovered the berries started to consume them. To summarize the dialectics I'll go through today, the both and of coffee, and I'll dive into each of these specifically during the episode, but here's an overview. Coffee has been described as a dangerous intoxicant and as a sober alternative to alcohol. It actually came out of the Muslim world where intoxicants are generally forbidden. Coffee has been a political threat to the ruling class. The Boston Tea Party and the American Revolution were both planned in coffee houses. And it's been a reinforcer of the status quo. Politicians have long met in those same coffee shops to plan ways to secure their power. It's been a threat to Christianity. In the early 1500s, Pope Clement VIII actually threatened to excommunicate anyone who drank what he called Satan's drink. And it's been described as a gift from God. That same pope was convinced to try coffee, and he wound up baptizing it as a Christian beverage. Maybe he was in some drunken stupor from Satan's drink. It's been used, well, it still is, to both relax and to perk up. Throughout the last 300 years, it's been used to prevent women from achieving equality. The original coffee shops were men only. And it's been used to instigate feminist movement. Those same coffee shops became places where women could get together and plan ways to destroy the patriarchy. It's been claimed to make men sexually impotent, and it's been claimed to enhance both the vitality of sperm, whatever that means, and the joy of orgasm. And then there's direct links to capitalism. It's been seen as both a threat to capitalism, like marijuana, anyone could technically grow it, and as a boon to capitalism. Coffee right now is the most popular drug in the world, more popular even than alcohol. It's currently the most popular trade commodity on Earth aside from oil. It's been used to break down class distinctions, much like the taverns of the 1700s. People meeting in early coffee houses could talk openly to people they normally didn't interact with. And it's been used to re-entrench those class distinctions. Some of the early failures to ban coffee from places like England and France were followed by decrees that only those who could afford an expensive license could run coffee shops, only the elite. It's been used to alienate us from each other. You can now buy a 50-gallon drum of coffee at the Quickie Mart so you don't have to interact with people to get your caffeine every morning. And it's been used to bring us together. Those coffee houses still exist, and they can be used as meeting places. It's been viewed as a threat to culture itself, as an exotic drug coming to destroy our morals, and it's been seen, maybe still is, as impossible to even separate from our culture. Coffee wakes people up after staying up too late drinking so they can head to the job they hate. And then there's slavery. Oh boy. By the late 1700s, something like 60% of the world's coffee was coming from Haiti, and 40% of the world's enslaved people were being dropped off there. Something like 40,000 people kidnapped from Africa and sent to Haiti every year to grow and harvest coffee. That's actually more than the United States at the time. Coffee actually drove slavery to a level never seen before, and it's been an instigator of slave revolts and emancipation movements. Haiti is no longer the biggest producer of coffee because those enslaved people joined forces and overthrew their tormentors. So, see what I mean? It's kind of a dialectical chemical. Let's change gears and then work our way back to this dialectical stuff because it's kind of cool how coffee works in the brain. Briefly, and simplified to the point of frustrating the neurologist, as you go through the day, a neurotransmitter called adenosine is slowly released from storage sites in your brain, and it builds up. The longer you're awake, the more adenosine you generally have floating around in your brain. And as it builds up and floats around in there, it binds to neurons, and the more that it binds, the sleepier you get. Adenosine actually lowers the electrical charge in a neuron, so it makes them less likely to fire, harder to fire. You feel tired. Caffeine's action on adenosine receptors leads to an increase in lots of other neurotransmitters, which would otherwise decrease because adenosine means sleep is supposed to be coming soon. And we feel much better about our day. We feel perked up. When you sleep, one of the many things your body does is remove, or I guess reuptake is a better term, it's the medical term. It reuptakes the adenosine so it can slowly leak out again the next day until you're tired again and it's time for bed. Caffeine binds to those adenosine sites better than adenosine. It's kind of stickier, I guess. And it doesn't have the same effects as adenosine, so it prevents us from feeling tired even if we don't get enough sleep, and we've still got a lot of leftover adenosine floating around up there. It dialectically both wakes you up and makes you more weary in the long run, as that adenosine keeps building up over days, but you don't really notice until the caffeine wears off. Caffeine also dilates blood vessels, which just means it delivers more blood to the arms and legs. But these things are why it's been so popular and so legal, celebrated even, in capitalist cultures. It's a drug that really makes it obvious how little drug policy has to do with drugs and how much it has to do with who is being seen by the public to use a specific drug. I mean, when your average user is a worn-out 9-to-5er heading to bust his ass every morning until he's 65 just to die owing more on his house than it's worth, well, you can bet capitalism will sell that shit on every corner. No problem. Alright, enough about adenosine, although it's worth mentioning that caffeine does have a half-life of something like 6 hours. That's how long it takes for half of whatever's in your system to work its way out. So if you drink a Red Bull or a cup of coffee at 2 in the afternoon to recharge, you'll still have half of the caffeine blocking your I'm tired chemicals at 9 o'clock at night, and 6 hours later, you might still struggle to go to sleep. As someone who needs 8 hours or more of sleep every night to be at 100%, I actually try to quit drinking caffeine by noon, but when I was in prison, oh man, I drank it all day. So that's how coffee works in the brain and with capitalism generally today. But how did we get here? Now, even though, like I said, we don't know when humans started to consume coffee, we do know that by the 1400s, humans had started to roast coffee beans, and by the 1500s, coffee beans started to appear in Europe. And since they came from Muslim cultures, it was often called the wine of Islam, again with the dialectics. And many people viewed it with suspicion, like a new option with a name you don't recognize on the menu at your favorite restaurant. Do you really want to try this strange new thing? Maybe I'll just stick with my tried and true cheeseburger. But by the mid-1600s, Coffee had become pretty popular, largely because of a stereotype, which isn't true, but that's still with us today. It's in lots of movies, that it can sober someone up if they're drunk. Again, with the dialectical view that it's both a drug and, quite literally in this case, the opposite of a drug. During the American Revolution, the United States switched to coffee to show their patriotism. Before that, we'd been drinking England's shitty tea and paying their taxes. John Adams wrote a letter to his wife that survived, describing how much he disliked coffee, but that he was going to try to start drinking it anyway because tea had become what he called unpatriotic. The American Revolution was actually planned in a coffee house, like I said, and so was the Boston Tea Party, and there's a connection to culture here worth digging a little deeper into. The U.S. has always been super capitalist, a country where the richest among us have disproportionate power compared to the rest of us. There's irony in the fact that coffee houses, like those early taverns I mentioned, were both vital to the American experiment becoming what it did, but also at times they were a threat to the powers that be. A place where people can get together and exchange ideas while consuming chemicals that make them feel energized, motivated, mentally sharp. And just like with alcohol, check out the episode a few weeks ago if you want more on that, this cultural journey showed us both sides of that coin. The cultural need for these spaces where people can openly exchange ideas and they can organize, and the threat that these spaces hold to the status quo. They're literally dangerous to those in charge. So of course they tried to ban them. And to riff on those bans a little bit, King Charles II actually issued a proclamation in 1675 suppressing coffee houses because he said they were places of breeding grounds for political unrest and false information, fake news, and that they could threaten the monarchy. They could threaten the status quo. In 1777, Frederick the Great, head of what was then Prussia, which is now Germany, Poland, and Russia, he tried to ban coffee, but instead he ended up requiring licenses for people who wanted to run coffee shops, and then he only gave those licenses to nobility, to rich people who, surprise, don't want to change the status quo, and they don't want to allow their businesses to be used to threaten their wealth. But then, any drug that can be made to conform in some way to capitalism's basic precepts, that drug can avoid outright prohibition and instead become bound up with the system. And as soon as that happens, that drug will cease to act as a challenge on the system and instead work to reinforce it. The dialectic will become one-sided. Think about psychedelics and how they were, in Tim Leary's model at least, so revolutionary that they threatened to make everyone, quote, turn on, tune in, and drop out, as Tim Leary said, out of college, out of industry, out of politics, out of fucking everything. And his use of language like that both earned him his fame and brought both him and the drugs he was promoting under the attack of the government. Leary lost his battle with the man, and everything considered psychedelic was outlawed. LSD, mushrooms, peyote, DMT, later on MDMA, all of it. Those damn peace-loving hippies working outside of capitalist norms and tripping themselves into a new reality, they must be stopped. That's how it was. But now think about psychedelics in our cultural imagination today. I mean, sure, there are still people like me who talk about how much we value the ego-dissolving effects of high doses of psychedelics. Sam Harris recently talked about taking something like 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms and locking himself in a dark closet for hours. But as psychedelics have re-entered the medical conversation, so has a new capitalist-friendly word. You've probably heard it: microdosing. Now, instead of taking a big dose of LSD this weekend and spending the day reconsidering the job you hate, the fucking religion you've always taken for granted, that tree in your backyard, which now seems like the most incredible thing on earth, why not just microdose all week so you can instead get just buzzed up enough to get through the day without noticing your misery quite as much? The dialectics of acid. Now, a couple episodes ago, I talked about how alcohol went through a similar cultural shift in our public understanding. When taverns were public spaces where people gathered face to face and drank and celebrated, ritualized, consumed, played, they also schemed and organized. The taverns were attacked by prohibitionists for being immoral institutions promoting addiction and vice, but the reasons the millionaires who could run advertisements and really get behind these movements, people like Ford, Rockefeller, Hearst, the last of whom was once owner of something like 25% of all of the media in the United States in the 1900s, the reason they got behind prohibition movements was because it wasn't going to impact their own ability to drink, and it would ensure their labor force wasn't drunk. Coffee, like alcohol and most drugs, has always been both a threat to the status quo of capitalism and a supporter of it. Today, corporations like Starbucks, Folgers, and Peet's, they're household names, making it feel to us like coffee is the most boring, pro-social chemical that exists. In neoliberal capitalism, the threatening nature of coffee has been so minimized today that you'd have a hard time even spotting it. It's almost like capitalists managed to make us all forget about the revolutionary power of these chemicals that make us feel good. Today we go to the coffee house to grab a stimulant and look at our computer, not really to organize or plot. We drink our Folgers in the morning to pump ourselves up just enough to not quit our fucking jobs, not because we want to sit there and rethink our life choices. That's kind of fitting, since behind all of those coffee beans lies all sorts of environmental and ethical issues, from clear-cutting forests to centuries of slave labor. So let's go there for a minute. By the late 1800s, Brazil had taken over the coffee market for the most part, and it's wild how capitalism informs so many histories of so many drugs. Coffee's no exception. By 1901, Brazil was selling more than 2 billion with a B pounds of coffee to the rest of the world, and by the 1920s, Brazil was clear-cutting something like 1,100 square miles of rainforest every year to grow more coffee. The roots of environmental destruction and racism are both the same roots of exploitation. Capitalism creates some wild problems when taken to extreme levels, and with that much coffee supporting their entire economy, 2 billion pounds a year, it was only a matter of time before Brazil outgrew its britches, so to speak. In 1906, as coffee prices free fell because they were growing so much of it, Brazil started borrowing money to buy their own coffee and to stockpile it so they could keep coffee prices artificially high by limiting the global supply. But they could only store so much coffee, and by 1929, a year that should ring bells for students of U.S. economic history, Brazil's scheme stopped working. The coffee industry became the first industry to crash out during the Great Depression, and a lot of historians believe the coffee crash in 1929 actually instigated the Great Depression. By 1930, Brazil literally started burning its coffee because there was just too much, and by 1937, they were burning something like 17 million bags, 130 pounds each, every year, even though worldwide consumption was only something like 26 million bags in 1937. Capitalism is about supply and demand, but it also sometimes requires destruction of supply, dialectics. And then, amidst this seemingly never-ending coffee price crash, other countries started growing coffee too, Colombia mainly. Since Brazil was still buying, storing, and burning coffee to drive the prices up, Colombia could sell their coffee for less and undercut Brazil. In 1937, while coffee prices were plummeting yet again, Brazil said fuck it and sold all of their coffee on the free market, which, surprise, caused the price to crash again. And history people will also recall that the world situation of 1937 was pretty bad. The world was on the verge of war. All that to say, this is where the U.S. government came in, amidst this long-term shit show of coffee price fixing, burning, and market crashing. By the 1920s, the United States was consuming around half of the coffee in the world, so we used those connections to make sure South American countries stayed on the right side of the wars, World War II and later on the Cold War. The U.S. literally underwrote the entire Brazilian overstock for 1941, 1942, and 1943 to prevent their government from joining the Axis powers. And those agreements did a lot more than artificially raise the price of coffee back up. They also gave the U.S. control of the coffee market. And, no surprise, we neoliberalized coffee in the early 1900s, slowly but surely blocking small growers from the market and essentially forcing them to sell their farms and their production companies to the big-time producers. Eventually, the biggest companies cornered the market, the story of neoliberalism. General Mills bought Maxwell House, Procter & Gamble bought Folgers and then sold it to Smuckers. The monopolization commenced. And at the same time as monopolization made coffee cheaper again, it also got shittier. Producers slowly upped the percentage of cheap Robusta beans to reduce the much better tasting Arabica beans in our home mixes because Robusta is, well, it's robust. It's easier to grow and harvest, so it's way cheaper to produce, but it doesn't taste as good. This is yet another interesting dialectic of coffee, one that's much more contemporary. It's actually happening right now with companies like Starbucks and Peet's and all the other organic, free trade, high-price craft coffee. While coffee led to monopolization of coffee producers and a cheapening of both price and quality, aka neoliberalism, it also sparked an entire new market in response to the shitty coffee that people got tired of drinking, the craft coffee market. In 1946, the United States consumed enough coffee for every person here to drink more than 46 gallons of it. This was the peak of industrialization, the hyper-Fordist age, and like I said, coffee fueled it. It really worked well with that mindset. This was also the heyday of early consumerism in advertising. And PR's earliest superstars were advertising the shit out of things like cigarettes, alcohol, and coffee in ads you heard at the beginning of this show, ads that would make us cringe nowadays. Amphetamine and methamphetamine were both also widely available, and they fit well with industrialization too. They would let people work long hours without fatigue as long as they were taken at reasonable doses. Again, anytime a drug plays well with capitalism, it'll be treated as culturally acceptable, while those drugs that don't, like heroin, will be targeted by those in power to protect their lifestyles, their profit. Maybe I'll dive back into amphetamines shortly using the dialectical lens like I'm doing on this episode. Let me know what y'all think. It's been kind of fun lately to read your emails and comments about some of these more outside-the-box episodes of late. But anyway, where was I? Oh, commodification and consumerism. The early years of the America we now all live in. The America where Nike and Gucci are how we show the world who we are. Are you a Ford guy, a Nissan gal, or a Chevy gender-neutral person? Do you love your Adidas shoes or your Metallica t-shirts? Do you drink Budweiser or Miller, Pabst or Blue Ribbon? Or do you drink microbrews because you're not one of those canned beer yuppies? We define ourselves by the products, by the name brands that we consume. You can give somebody 2 bags of chips, the same chips, one labeled with a generic name, and they will really believe that they taste different, that the Doritos taste better than the No-Ritos. So coffee got caught up in the same ideology in the mid-1900s.
To grow coffee this good, you need the Colombian sun. But to make it, all you need is 100% Colombian coffee. For the coffee trees of Juan Valdez, it is the best climate in the world.
You might have heard of Kopi Luwak, the most expensive coffee in the world. The beans are eaten by Asian palm civets and then pooped out. If you drink that, well, then you're way cooler than the Starbucks losers. That's the craft market. Good, expensive, custom coffee just for you. Juan Valdez became the National Federation of Coffee Growers of Colombia's advertising dream in the mid-1900s, and he led to a lot of the other companies joining in this propaganda party. You heard a mashup of those nasty commercials from the 50s and 60s at the start of this episode. Coffee became a commodity on the consumer market. Instant coffee, flavored coffee, caffeine-free coffee, which is, I guess, coffee-free coffee, and of course, coffee for wives looking to please their asshole husbands. These new products fought for consumer dollars, while the mom-and-pop craft stores sold the good stuff for a lot more. Capitalism was victorious. And we're kind of in this almost post-neoliberal stage now, particularly with coffee, where some of the craft distributors are actually so big that they're becoming major coffee distributors, which almost always causes them to then update their morals and join the capitalist project they started their companies to protest. But then that's why capitalism is so popular, I guess. So coffee, another drug caught up in a neoliberal tug-of-war between revolution and relegation, between, I don't know, what's another clever word combo? Between rejecting and rejoicing in the status quo, between burning the system to the ground and offering it an award. All right, enough of that. Speaking of neoliberalism, though, it's always worth talking about the difference between the natural form of a psychoactive drug and the processed, distilled, more potent form that capitalism encourages profiteers to extract and then to market. Coca-Cola was one of the first companies to get sued by the government for putting high levels of extracted caffeine in Coke as a replacement for the coca extract they'd recently removed. This was a funny case. I recently just read a bit more about it and realized that I didn't get it right in earlier episodes. It was way more complicated than the government just having a problem with caffeine. It had to do more with additives that were either improperly labeled or included at levels so high that the government said they weren't safe for consumption. Coca-Cola contained caffeine, not coffee. It was more about protecting people from getting too much caffeine than banning caffeine outright, and Coca-Cola eventually got that case dropped by agreeing to just lower the amount of caffeine per can. By then, the guy who'd originally brought the suit had died, so it kind of fizzled out. The weird similarities between the U.S. government's involvement with coffee and cocaine are hard to ignore as well. There have been lots of times the CIA and other government organizations have either looked the other way or outright participated in bringing cocaine into the country to support revolutions in South America and a number of different countries. And that's the same thing we've done with coffee, albeit in a slightly less hidden way. But we've also never banned coffee or caffeine, so it's hard to say what would have happened if we had. I mean, caffeine doesn't seem to be quite as neurologically rewarding as cocaine, but given how many people use it every day, it's possible it would have been distilled and then smuggled into the U.S. and then adulterated and marked up and all the other problems that come with a war on drugs. And who knows, we might well be waging a war against some new form of synthetic caffeine right now, the fentanyl of coffee, if we allowed the iron law of prohibition to take effect by banning caffeine along the way. So maybe neoliberalism has something of a silver lining, although I'm suspicious. Okay, that's enough. I'm gonna go have a cup of coffee. Until next time, I'm Ben Boyce.
You know, the girls down at the office make better coffee on their hot plates.
Oh, this coffee is criminal.
Did you ever see Larry looking so happy?
Well, honey, happiness is a vacation. Away from your coffee.